in mind. So the two things that happened, I talked about the Republican tradition being revived in England, being spread really throughout Europe down to about 1800, and feeding the American Revolution. But then two things happened that I think dramatically changed the Republican tradition and ensured that for a time we lost the tradition. What I wanted for a long time now, many other people who identify themselves like me as neo-Republicans want, is to revivify the older tradition. Okay, so here are the two things that happened which, so to speak, drove the republicanism I've described out of view. One was what I call the English mistake, and the other was the French mistake. Okay, so what was the English mistake? Well, think yourselves back to England about 1780. The great figure who's emerging in England in that period as the reformist philosopher, theorist, is Jeremy Bentham, who has an enormous impact on English political and social life, and indeed more broadly too. But Bentham does an interesting thing. He wants to argue, in effect, and this is a very positive and a good thing, he wants to argue that the citizens that the state should protect are not just propertied mainstream males, but that they also include women and workers, and indeed, though he didn't concentrate on that, on those of, say, non-Christian religions. I think that he lost his nerve, because he would have argued quite naturally that what government should do is work for the freedom of all these citizens, including the women and the workers. I think he lost his nerve because it was pretty clear to him that if you were going to ensure that women at that period did not have masters, then you would have to change all of family law, which made women basically into almost the slaves of their husbands or of their fathers. Equally, if you argued that workers should have freedom in the sense of non-domination, in the sense of not having any master in their lives, then you would have to change, absolutely revolutionize the contemporary master-servant law, which really did give masters enormous power over their servants. So what Bentham did is he redefined liberty. And he said it's enough for liberty that you're not interfered with. And so what he argued was that let's have a state that protects all the citizenry, that's the good thing, but that protects them only in the sense of protecting them against actual interference, not in the sense of protecting them against all forms of domination. So, for example, I think he thought, well, women should be protected against interference so far as that's likely on the streets or in the public life, but they don't need to be protected against their husbands, for example. So he left the law as it was, and he argued, well, husbands who are good Christians won't actually use the power that they had under the law against their wives. They won't actually interfere, and so their wives will be free in the sense of not actually being interfered with, though of course they wouldn't be free in the older sense of not being dominated, because the husband with this power was their dominus. Equally, he argued that workers, so long as they were not actually interfered with by their employer, and he thought that economic rationality would lead employers not to interfere with their workers, he thought that so long as they were not actually interfered with, they too would be free in the sense of freedom as non-interference. So he thinned out the idea of freedom, and he expanded the domain of people who would enjoy freedom. The result was, I think, classical liberalism. Classical liberalism basically says people should have rights that give them freedom as non-interference. But it did not argue that people should have the sort of powers and protections and options that would give them freedom as non-domination. I'll come back to that with an example in just a moment. But first let me mention the, as you might think of it, the French mistake. The French went the other way. So think of Rousseau now rather than Bentham. So Rousseau did hold on to the notion that freedom required non-domination. You remember from your Rousseau, those of you who read him, or those, the younger people who will read him, that for Rousseau, to be free requires that you don't depend on the goodwill of anybody else. Personal dependence on the goodwill of others would make you unfree. You're their subject. Rousseau had an abhorrence of dependency, of having a dominus. So for him, unlike Bentham, freedom really required non-domination, not having a master in your life. However, where Bentham, and I should have said this, held on to the idea of the mixed constitution and dropped the idea of freedom, what Rousseau does is exactly the opposite. He holds on to the idea of freedom, but drops the idea of the mixed constitution. Because what he introduces is the great French idea that there has to be a single sovereign who's in charge. And he argued that having a mixed constitution meant that you had no single person in charge, and he thought of that as a sort of chaos, as a state of nature, actually. And he thought that in order to have government, you had to have a single strong pair of hands, a single sovereign. Of course, he thought that that sovereign should be the people, le peuple souverain. It should be the sovereign people. And they would come into being insofar as they make an explicit or perhaps implicit contract with one another that they, the people, will rule by majority vote, giving expression to what Rousseau thought as the general will that they would all equally share in. But this leads to, where Bentham leads to liberalism in the classic form, Rousseau leads to what is often called, and rightly called, I think, communitarianism. It's the view that the single homogeneous community with a single general will, rather than a mixed constitution, should be the organ whereby people are lifted out of dependency and non-domination and domination. You see that in France still today. So, for example, the debate about la voile, the veil, and Muslim women in France, I think it's an extraordinary occurrence that almost all of the French Parliament voted in favor of eliminating all religious symbols or symbols of identity other than French identity in the schools. Because we all know, we can see that that is extremely dominating from the point of view of a certain part of the Muslim population in France. But within the French tradition of thinking, it makes perfect sense, in the Rousseauvian tradition of thinking. Now the French, I think that's also a mistake. Just as the retreat to a classic liberalism is a loss, so the retreat to this sort of communitarian belief in a single homogeneous community with a single general will is equally a mistake. I would like to return to civic republicanism, civicism, in the older sense in which there are two sides to it. On the one hand, we have got to protect our citizens, all the citizens in a neo-republican sense, an inclusive citizenry. We've got to protect all of them against domination of any kind. Domination, so far as it's possible, in the family, domination in the local community, domination in the workplace, domination in the schoolroom, domination in the church, domination in respect of corporations, domination in every area of civic life. We've got to protect against domination, the power of the strong over the weak, but we've got to do that with a state that is itself faithful to the tradition of the mixed constitution in being responsive to the ideas in the population, among the citizenry, and in being checked and regulated by dispersed centers of power.